for me because this was a place that I came in my late teens and early 20s when I was also asking big questions. And back then we weren't down here, but we were upstairs in the upper room. And again, it was a group much like this. So what a gift it is to be here kind of 20 years later to share with you tonight on a particular topic, an interesting topic. Even as I've been putting it together, I've been going through the motions. I've shared with a few people, I'm going to be talking on anger. And they've said, well, that makes total sense. So I'm kind of sitting with that, you know. And I started to think, okay, well, when was the last time I felt really angry? And I can give you the date. It's the 31st of August, just gone. And I can tell you that because that was the date that the Oasis tickets went on sale. I don't know if I've got any other kind of teens from the 90s. I turned 18 in 2000, and so I was very much looking forward to my £175 tickets to Wembley Stadium. I don't know if any of you were online that day, but that's not quite how it went down, and 8 hours later, I was very deeply in rage. Me and my sisters, who were all kind of talking over WhatsApp, trying desperately to get hold of these tickets. We failed miserably, 4 of us failed miserably. So what was kind of disappointment and sadness as we leapt into the hellhole that is Twitter, it suddenly turned into a very steep curve towards wanting to find the Gallagher brothers and express my opinion on kind of premium tickets that day. So that was my last experience of feeling particularly angry. So I grew up in St Albans, and well, I didn't grow up there, but I went to school there. I went to an all-girls school, and the way that we dealt with anger, I don't know if any of you went to all-girls schools, I'm not looking at the gentlemen, but you know, any of us that went there, we had an interesting way of dealing with anger. It was very passive-aggressive. It was very quiet and reserved. Getting a lot of nods from the ladies. We know this, right? It was kind of often behind our backs. We rarely, I remember that very keenly. So this was very much my experience. Now, my sweet husband of 17 years is sat over here, and he went to an all-boys school. And when we talk about our teenage experience of school life, he'll say, well, you just punch each other and move on. Kind of envious of that kind of boys' school mentality. Okay, it was Essex, hence the punching, but there was a punching moment. I wonder if boys do actually have it a bit easier than girls. I know it's a sweeping statement, it's probably a little unfair, but certainly I think when I was a young woman going through school, that was probably how I felt. I had a younger brother. I could see that he wasn't having as much kind of passive-aggressive interactions as I was, but kind of got me thinking. So in my home then, what was my experience of anger? If that was my school life, those kind of early kind of interactions with this really normal kind of emotion, my home life was really interesting because I grew up one of 5, small house, just outside of London, sort of in Hertfordshire. And my dad was a very kind of dominant character in the household, and he wasn't great with his words when he was angry. And he was somebody that would perhaps go more quiet than outspoken when angry. Again, I'm getting some nods. I think there's probably some of us that act like this. And that's how I found, growing up then into adulthood, that's how I behaved around anger. Looking back at this kind of all-girls situation that was, you know, quite repressed almost in the way that we would express things. Then in my family home, where anger probably wasn't talked about, it was more silent. You ever experienced that silent anger? Ooh, sometimes that's worse, right? I think now I would much prefer the bust-up than the silence. So yes, there was this silence probably in secondary school, this silence in home. So then, I get engaged at 22, and we get married when I'm 24. Now, Neil and I had a kind of traditional courtship, and we didn't live together before we were married. So when we moved in together, we'd had a fantastic wedding. We got married in Malta, had a really lucky to have a beautiful honeymoon in Thailand. So we'd been out of the country for kind of 3 weeks, kind of married, came back. He was just like, you're going to tell that story. But yes, I'm an oversharer, here we are. I come back and we start to live together. Girls, it's really hard to live with a boy. It was really hard to live with a boy. And that first day, I kid you not, this is so funny. I kid you not, I was 24, it was the first day, and we had sort of planned what we were going to do with our space, and had all of these kind of great ideas. And on the first day, like, Neil is sat down on his, what was then a PSP, like gaming system, sat there on his gaming system, rather than doing all the exciting things with our space that we said we were going to do to make it a home. He sat there gaming. I was raging. I was so furious. But what had I learned? I'd learned to be silent in that anger. So he's over there playing his game thinking this is great, we're married, and I'm sitting here playing my game in our home with my wife, and I'm over here silently losing my mind. And so what do? I can see that he's not responding to this silence. He's kind of acting quite normally, completely ignoring me. I felt he wasn't, he was gaming. I felt he was completely ignoring me, so what did I do? I left the house. I swear we've been married this was our first day in our house. I left the house and I got the train to my parents' house. I got the train to my parents' house and I sat down very proudly in the lounge and I was like, I'm not going back there and you can't make me. And they were like, darling, you get one night and then we're sending you back. And she's like, oh, okay. So I'm suddenly having to learn to deal with something that really I'd never dealt with before. So I was this 24-year-old learning how to have conflict in a positive way, how to deal with these kind of feelings that are really perfectly normal and natural that I'd never really had to deal with in any particular way. And God bless this sweet saint of a man. He said, it's very important that you tell them, I taught you how to deal with it, Becky. And I said, thank you, Neil. You get the acknowledgement you deserve. He did teach me, I think, over the last 17 years, how we might kind of deal healthily with anger. So if we think about fight, flight, or freeze, this kind of common phrase that we'll understand, won't we? I was flight. You can see that quite clearly. Off I went, ran, got the train down to Watford Junction and was like, pick me up. Let's think about the science behind this. Because I'm not a brain scientist. I'm a youth minister. I'm a youth worker. That's my thing. But let's talk through some of the science when it comes to what happens to us when we feel anger. Now, if there are any brain scientists in the room, hold on to those questions until the very end. And as Chris said, when everyone else has gone, that's the time to kind of talk about this bit. I'm kidding. Let's see. Now, when we experience a threat, when we sense that there's a threat around us, a part of the brain called the amygdala comes online. And the amygdala is going to be the thing that sets off the alarm. So the alarm is going, the amygdala is saying there is a threat, we need to deal with this. So once that warning has been raised, part of the brain called the hypothalamus, that then comes online because that's the brain's control center. So when we know that the control center kind of knows what's going on, it's going to kind of tell us how to respond. It's going to kind of evaluate what's going on around us. It's going to tell us how to respond. Now, in reality, that takes less than a second. But let's imagine that the threat that we've perceived, so a typical example, is the tiger coming towards us, right? So we know the tiger's coming towards us. Instinctively, we are going to get out of the way. The hypothalamus actually hasn't even had an opportunity to get involved because the amygdala has hijacked our system. So the amygdala has just dealt with the problem and it's got us out of the way. Now, let's imagine we've been hijacked. The amygdala's kind of taken control. A third part of the brain then comes online, the orbital frontal cortex. This bit of the brain comes online and it says, is this the best decision? Let's just evaluate what you're doing. Are you making the best choice? It's our brake system. So let's say we're really running, but we might be running towards something worse. The orbital frontal cortex is going to be saying, oh, okay, let's evaluate again. Let's put on the brakes. Let's see what it is that we should be doing. Now, what's really interesting with the orbital frontal cortex is that this is the bit that is essential when we're experiencing anger. because that's the bit of the brain that can help us not to get aggressive. This is the bit of the brain that helps us have that control that you mentioned earlier.
No, it's the first time I have control. No, I'm just joking.
But good for
more or
you.
less.
Good for you.
Usually I just go for it.
It can be similar. So let's imagine that your boss, a family member, a friend, is shouting at you. Okay, and you're standing there, you're taking it. If we find ourselves kind of like lashing out, maybe getting a bit aggressive, that's probably because the orbital frontal cortex hasn't been able to put the brake system on. Your amygdala has just taken over and hasn't been able to be reined back in. Now that could be for a number of reasons, because when that warning system goes off, your body gets flooded with hormones. You're going to get some adrenaline, you're going to get some cortisol. Sometimes that's going to be too much for the braking system and the amygdala is just in charge and the hijack happens, there's no holding it back. Things like lack of sleep, things like not eating enough, things like not drinking enough, also mean that our orbital frontal cortex isn't going to be able to do what it needs to do. We're kind of putting ourselves at a bit of a disadvantage. So the hijacking still is able to take place. Think back to the infamous Oscar ceremony. Will Smith. Oh, his amygdala was in charge. There was no putting the brakes on that guy unless Chris was going to take his wife's name out of his mouth. Will up there slap. And you could kind of almost see Chris Rock go into freeze. So I'm flight. Will Smith fight. We're seeing this perfect example. Then we see Chris Rock freeze. I actually watched it again last night just before doing this thing, and I was just like, this poor sucker. Like, he really did freeze, you know. And I in that moment, I thought, we've all been there. We have all been in that freeze moment. I bet afterwards, Chris had 1,000 things that he wanted to say in that moment. I bet he had 1,000 comebacks. You know how we always come up with the great comeback after the fact? That's the freeze. We get into the freeze, we don't know what we're going to say. Our brain is putting a pause on us. Our brain is saying, no, pause, evaluate, hypervigilant. The brain's hypervigilant in this time, but it's actually not letting you do anything. It's just evaluating, making sure that you're safe. How can we avoid this threat? So we're in the pause motion. So, let's say our amygdala is hijacked. Our orbital frontal cortex isn't able to put the brakes on. How do we deal with that? You know, this is something that happens to all of us. I bet that we can all come up with examples of times when we've just had that blackout, right? Where we just think, after the fact you're thinking, what did I do? Will Smith probably had that moment. I think his wife probably had it for him as well. I'd say that there are two things that we can actually do to help ourselves. First is that our bodies actually act as a warning system. So again, think back to that time that you felt angry. I wonder if you can think of what happened in your body. Heart probably started racing. Maybe you experienced a bit of dry mouth. Maybe your palms started sweating. Maybe you started to get like, you know, these kind of pins and needles in your arms like you're ready. You know, your body starts to get you ready. There's a warning system that goes on inside of you. When those chemicals are released, you've got the adrenaline rushing around your body, all sorts of things are going to be going on. So even if you haven't quite intellectually caught up with yourself, your body is telling you what's going on. So oftentimes this tool, like the traffic light system, is used, right? So if you are in a normal state of calm, you're in the green zone. If you start to feel that kind of palpitation, if you start to feel that rush, maybe you feel like you're limbering up a little bit, maybe you start to feel that kind of deep irritation, maybe you start to feel a bubbling, you're in amber. This is your kind of first warning sign that something's going on. You then might hit the red zone. If you're hitting the red zone, you might be lashing out, you might be freezing, you might be escaping. Whatever your fight, flight, or freeze, could be a fright as well, I suppose. Whatever it is, that's going to be engaged during that red zone. So we actually all have that opportunity during the kind of the green, the amber zone, to sort of just check in with ourselves and say, maybe I need to do something here. Maybe I need to act earlier than I usually let myself. Because sometimes it can be really nice to indulge that little bit of anger. Sometimes that can feel good, right? It can feel like, we deserve that. This person's driven me crazy. I deserve to sit in this for a bit and kind of, dwell in it. No, you're in the amber zone and you're moving really quickly towards red, because the amber is the warning to say, I need to take a step back. So that's the first thing I think that helps us deal with that kind of unhealthy anger, or kind of getting us into that red zone. The second thing is that we can actually practice activating our orbital frontal cortex. We can practice using our braking system in our brains. Now there's, I would say, two really simple and easy ways to practice bringing that part of the brain online. And the two things that I would suggest, and countless kind of research papers will say the same, two simple ways to bring that part online is meditation and relaxation. Those two things help us to practice bringing that part of the brain online. So it could be that actually that's not something that you do in your normal life and you find yourself running into anger quite regularly. Whereas actually sometimes practicing those kind of really simple things, meditation, relaxation, no tricks, no kind of like, big kind of bill at the end of a session, really simple, meditation, relaxation, those two things bring online the orbital frontal cortex. We can help ourselves put the braking systems on. It's like, practicing that muscle, helping that muscle to grow and develop. I'd also say, in that kind of world of perhaps the trickier anger, perhaps that unwanted Will Smith anger, or me leaving the house a day after being married anger, those types of moments, I'd say there's also something extra that we can do. So we've already said we can practice the traffic light system, we can practice activating the orbital frontal cortex, and I'd say next, we can work out what our triggers are. This is where we need to go to work. Because oftentimes anger, although an emotion in and of itself, is often called the secondary emotion. Because anger is usually activated by a different feeling. So people talk about an anger iceberg. On the top of the water, you're going to see anger, frustration, irritation, maybe aggression. Underneath the water, we're going to see something else. C.S. Lewis said this: I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. Whew, love that. I sat with my anger long enough until she told me her name was grief. I wonder what the name of your anger is. Might be sadness, shame, guilt. Could be all sorts of things. What is it that's under the waters? What's that bigger part of the iceberg? Because that is often the activating trigger toward irritation, frustration, anger, aggression. I was working with a year 11 girl, and we were doing some things around mental health, and anger was something she particularly struggled with. And we did this session, she was kind of learning about the anger iceberg, she was learning about, the kind of traffic light system. I went back, I saw her about 6 weeks later, and I said, how are you getting on? And she said, before we talked about this, I wasn't actually able to get through an entire maths lesson. I was just like, oh, I feel seen. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, what was the other? She said, I was just always so angry at my teacher, and we would get into it, and we'd fight, and I'd go in on him, and he'd send me out, and I'd always end up in the corridor and getting told off. So that was terrible. Okay. So what's happening now? And she said, now I've worked out why I'm angry, and it's not at him, and I haven't left the lesson since. And I was just like, this was a year 11 girl. Sometimes we don't realise, sometimes we think that anger is the thing. when anger almost never is the thing, but we need to put in the work to find out what it is. What is the bottom of that iceberg? So let's get back to our question. I'm kind of dancing around. When is anger good? So we've looked at kind of that unhealthy Will Smith, fight, flight, freeze, that kind of messiness that we often find ourselves in. When is anger good? What is righteous anger? When is it healthy? What does that look like? What examples do we have? I like to quote Aristotle, makes me seem smart, so you'll indulge me, thank you. He said this: anybody can become angry, that's easy. But to be angry with the right person, and to the right degree, and at the right time, and for the right purpose, and in the right way, that is not within everybody's power, and that is not easy. So even from the beginning, it's kind of being laid out for us that this righteous anger, this kind of good, healthy anger, actually is probably going to be a rarity, because this is difficult. These are difficult boundaries to put in place on something that can be messy, that can be complicated and complex. So what does that mean for us? Well, I would say that there are times in my life, and I'm sure in yours, when that anger has been good, that it's helped us to recognise an injustice, that it's helped us to speak up for somebody that is oppressed or bullied or who is being unfairly treated. I wonder if there are things going on in the world. I know that there are things going on in the world, and maybe even more locally to you, that deserve your anger. What are those things? Now that anger, that can be channeled. The action that arises from that anger could be a really positive thing. That will help bring about change. That anger will lead us to sign a petition, to contact an MP, to take part in a protest, to have a serious conversation with a teacher, a boss, a family member. It might make us seek out charities that deal with the issue that we're struggling with. Just anger can lead to really great things. And what's even better is that it's been shown that people who are actively involved in their communities, that those people who feel a sense of purpose, of achieving something and of doing something with impact, they live happier, more fulfilled lives. That getting involved in causes that you believe in will improve your mental health and well-being. So it benefits those for whom you're advocating, but it benefits us as well. We're going to be kind of living this healthier, happier, more fulfilled life. Now, I feel like we can't talk about anger without talking about the incredible Dr. Martin Luther King. I feel like he is the gold standard by which we can look at this particular topic and look at how anger channeled in the right way can have huge, meaningful, purposeful impact. I found an article in Inc. magazine written by a professor at Columbus Business School. And I wonder if you'll indulge me a bit. It's a fairly chunky quote that I'd like to read us, but I think that it just sums up the kind of the work and the project of Dr. King. The professor is called Hitendra, and this is what he writes. Great leaders often have a strong capacity to experience anger. It wakes them up and makes them pay attention to what is wrong in their environment or in themselves. Without anger, they would not have the awareness or the drive to fix what is wrong. But they also know the downside of anger, wage a firm battle to tame it within themselves. One such moment for Dr. King came when, in December 1955, he led talks with the authorities in Montgomery, Alabama, on negotiating the end of the bus boycott that was hurting both the whites and African Americans. He realized that the whites were not ready to give up their segregation privileges. The talks were heading for a stalemate, And what was more, the other party was trying to portray Dr. King as the sole stumbling block within the agreement. Dr. King said, "That Monday, I went home with a heavy heart. I was weighed down by a terrible sense of guilt, remembering that on 2 or 3 occasions, I had allowed myself to become angry and indignant. I had spoken hastily and resentfully, yet I knew that this was no way to solve a problem. You must not harbour anger, I admonished myself. You must be willing to suffer the anger of the opponent and yet not return anger. You must not become bitter. No matter how emotional your opponents are, you must be calm." Hitendra, our author, continues, "Only by taming his own anger did King earn the right to become a messenger of peaceful struggle to the people of the nation. An acid test came his way on a night in 1956 when his home in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed by white extremists. In his autobiography, Dr. King wrote, 'While I lay in that quiet front bedroom, I began to think of the viciousness of people who would bomb my home. I could feel the anger rising when I realized that my wife and baby could have been killed. I was once more on the verge of corroding hatred, and once more I caught myself and said, you must not allow yourself to become bitter.'" Hitendra, our author, continues, "That night he didn't just quell his own stirring for vengeance, but also that of the restless and roused masses who were outside his house, angered and ready to strike a blow at the establishment, until they were soothed and moved by his words. We are not advocating violence," Dr. King said. "We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them, love them, and let them know that you love them." Dr. King teaches us how to bring peace, even when we ourselves are going to be experiencing some incredibly volatile feeling emotions. He's the gold standard, as I said. This is a man whose example we can look to. He didn't stop feeling angry, but he channeled it. So, how did I, who, when I said to people, I'm talking about anger, they kind of went, that makes sense. How have I learned to channel some of that anger? What have I done? Because I know that during my life, I've been a volatile character. This is anger is something I'm familiar with. So what did I do to try and become more channeled, more impactful rather than disappearing or just kind of dwelling in my anger? Well, I'd say that there's probably 3 things that I did. Firstly, I went to therapy. I think sometimes that's what we need to do, people. There is nothing wrong with saying that sometimes we need somebody else to help us work out what is going on in our brain. Okay, nothing wrong with that at all. There are good doctors out there who are more qualified than me to help me understand myself. So if we get the opportunity, do it hilariously. It was actually my boss that recommended therapy. I think that says a lot. It says a lot. And I said yes. Here we are. Secondly, more hilariously, in the last 5 weeks, I've started boxing. That's right, people. I've started boxing. I know Joe's face just then was classic. Boxing has been a special moment. The discipline, but the great cathartic movements of boxing is definitely helping. So there's therapy. There's something about putting some of that aggression and some of that kind of feeling and emotion, putting it to good use. Love a bit of exercise. And lastly, I would say that prayer has helped me. I'd say I'm Christian, and discovering my faith and becoming serious about my faith, learning about who Jesus is, learning about what the church has to say about peace, the same way that Dr. King talked about. Learning that for myself was really important. Learning about who Jesus was as this man. This was a God who could have stayed in the heavens as God, but decided, no, I want to get down with them in the mess and in the craziness, in the joy and in the messiness. I'm going to be there with them, fully man, fully God, in some great beautiful mystery. This is a God who knew what it was to feel anger. There's a whole bit about it in the Bible about him like upending tables. I'm like, it's my man. I feel seen, right? That's my God right there. Good anger. He was showing us what it is to have good anger. But didn't he also teach us peace? This is a God who, in a boat with his disciples, slept through a storm. I love a guy that can sleep through a storm. I would tell you that my husband slept through an earthquake, no lie. Earthquake in LA, slept through it, unbelievable. But Jesus on the boat, sleeping through this storm, I need that. I need somebody who's going to teach me to sleep through the storm. I've got a card in front of my computer in my home office, and it says, "You are a storm sleeper." And I'm like, I need that. I need to be a storm sleeper, and I've got a God who can show me how to do it. And more than show me how to do it, he can empower me to do it. This isn't a God that keeps things to himself. He doesn't gatekeep. This isn't a God who is just like, oh, look at the things that I can do. You'll never be able to do this. He said, you're going to do better. You're going to do bigger. You're going to do more. I'm interested in that God. I'm interested in a God that's going to tell me that I can do more than him, that I'm going to do greater things, that there will be greater signs than the things that he did. So I want to learn how to be a storm sleeper. And I know that I'm not going to get it right every time. I know that there are going to be those times when I'm going to run into the red zone, when my amygdala is going to hijack my brain, and I'm going to need something different. I'm going to need that practicing of meditation, of relaxation, of that prayer, and I'm going to need God literally to come in and calm the storm. If I can't sleep through it, I've got Jesus who tells me that he will calm it. This is a miracle-working, peace-bringing, consoling, beautiful God that can calm my storm when I'm in the midst of it, if I just remember to ask him. Final thought, and I will land the plane. There is a beautiful part in the Old Testament in the Bible when a guy called Elijah is furious at God. And he is shouting at him and he's saying, God, I am so angry, I want to die. And God sort of goes, okay, Elijah, have a sleep. So Elijah goes to sleep. And when he wakes up, God says, have a snack. He has a snack. And suddenly Elijah isn't so mad anymore. And he's a little calmer and he can go about his day. So if you take nothing else, take away, we can never underestimate the power of a nap. Thank you so much.